Good evening, everybody. Good to see you. This is creating quite a lot of chat in the chat. So if you are joining us and you haven't read my question was, has anyone been up a volcano? And if so, which one? So there's lots of Canary Island answers there. And yeah, we went up that one with the Laycocks, who maybe haven't actually joined in yet. They've often do come in at some point. The one that you mentioned, Malcolm Mount Tede, or I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it, but there's a little cable car thing up there, which is really good. So some really interesting ones here. We have, go back to the beginning again. Yeah, Bridget, I was reading about that one. I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it. Is it Nyaragongo or Inyarogongo? Anyway, you can't tell me because you can speak, but I can't hear. Few for that one as well. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Kilimanjaro, and related ones. And then Peter, was that both of you? Haleakala volcano in Hawaii, 3,000 meters, and apparently it's freezing up there. So you don't want to be wearing your grass skirt when you walk up there, do you really? Then a few Italian ones. Anne saw Stromboli erupting when I went on a med cruise. I mean, that must have been really quite some experience seeing that. A few of you been in extinct volcanoes, various locations. Rob Heskins climbed Vesuvius. So Grace, again, sorry about the pronunciations, Bisoke in Rwanda, which is close to the DR Congo border. So I don't know if it's in the same range of volcanoes as the one that Bridget's been up. Simon's mum's been up Etna, probably not a good plan right now. Couple in New Zealand, yes. Well, New Zealand is the land of the volcano, isn't it? So when we were in New Zealand, we went skiing just on where you could see Mount Doom, as it is in Lord of the Rings, where they filmed Mount Doom. We went skiing on there, so that was quite cool. Andy, the question is, have you been up a volcano, and if so, which one? And I've just been commenting on the fact that we went with you up a volcano in Tenerife, but I don't know if you've been up any other volcanoes. Knowing that you are well travelled, it is entirely possible that you have. So yeah, I mean, obviously wherever you get one volcano, you do tend to get other volcanoes that are perhaps less well known in the area, and if you're in that area, you might well have gone up them. Yeah, that's the one, Andy. So I just had a little look because it was kind of interesting to see. I see. To see which volcanoes were currently on the erupting list, so that you could avoid them, because I'm a source of great information to you, and at the moment it's particularly important to avoid erupting volcanoes. So in Italy, currently on the red list is Stromboli and Etna, so you might not want to go there. And Iceland's got a few grumbling ones. That one that erupted and no one could fly anywhere for ages. I don't think it is that one, by the way. In Africa, we have one called something like Erta Ale in Ethiopia, and then the one that you guys have mentioned in Congo, that's erupting currently. Indonesia has got a whole long list of them, of course. Lots in the red and quite a few in the orange as well. The Ring of Fire is being sticking up to its name. It has a lot that are currently erupting or thinking about it as well. South America has some in Ecuador and in Peru and in Chile, and a few in Colombia. And Mexico, quite enthusiastic. Or Mexico and Central America, also quite enthusiastic. Popocatépetl, I've always loved that one. My granny used to test me on things like volcanoes. It's kind of a strange relationship, and that was one of my favourites. And then a few others as well in Guatemala and Nicaragua. uh, and Costa Rica as well. So there are a lot of erupting volcanoes, and it's really interesting. I don't know if interesting is the right word to use, but if you go to places where there are volcanoes, and of course, many of them are just dormant, not extinct. Um, it's shocking how many people live there. Obviously, because the land around is incredibly fertile, isn't it? So people build their houses, and anyway, it hasn't erupted for years, decades, maybe even longer. And so they raise their families and they plant their crops because it's a really good place to live. And they just live on the sides of these volcanoes, just hoping that the giant stays asleep and that he doesn't waken up again. And if he does, it's not of too great a consequence. So we seem to have found ourselves around quite a lot of volcanoes in our lives, but the two that particularly strike me this evening are when Mike and I were traveling back in 98, 99. And I'll tell you the reason in a moment. So we went up a volcano called Volcan Pacaya in Guatemala, not far from Guatemala City. We climbed it at night with an armed guard, and you could smell the sulfur, and you could see the red of the molten lava kind of at the top, and it was hot. You could sense the heat that was coming out of it, but it was basically dormant. Nothing had happened for ages and ages, and so lots of trips went up and down this mountain at night, this volcano at night, for some unknown reason. And then when we were in Ecuador, we went up a volcano called Tungurahua, and it was a 2-day hike, and you slept in a mountain hut, and had the most horrible and disgusting food ever in my life on that night, which is just what you need to prepare you to climb a volcano. And we bought some cheap dried pasta, and when we cooked it, it just disintegrated into sort of flour and water. It wasn't pleasant. And we climbed up there as well. And in truth, Mike made it to the top. I didn't quite, because I got that altitude sickness because it was really, really high. So wandered down on my own pretty much. It's probably not wise. Anyway, so we went up these 2 volcanoes in Central and South America, and within like a couple of years, they had both erupted violently and were on the international news. So I don't know what you have to say about that, really. Neither of them had erupted for like literally decades, probably even longer, until maybe we're just heavy-footed. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what the reason is, but both of them have erupted in a fairly lively manner, and Volcan Pacaya is still erupting to this day. I wonder, for all these people, if you said to them, it's going to erupt violently on this particular day, the giant is going to wake up. I wonder if it would change people's behavior and thinking. I was watching something on Sicily recently, and their volcano erupts regularly, and people just carry on completely as normal. Perhaps because they don't think it's that bad, perhaps because they're used to it. They're acclimatized to what happens, to the ash clouds, to how you behave, to what you do to take precautions. If we know something's going to happen, does it change anything about the way we live, or do we just acclimatize to our environment and then just not worry about it? I think often we do. Even the things that we don't like. Even look at this last year. At the beginning, it was a complete shock to the system, and whilst we still don't like very much of what we're dealing with, we are massively acclimatized to it. So this morning we had a team morning on Zoom. We normally go up to Scargill whenever we have a team away morning. But this morning we had it on Zoom, of course, because what choice do you have? And a friend of mine who lives in Sydney, Australia, led it for us because you can, can't you? Because we've got acclimatized to what we're dealing with, even if we don't always like it. So this chapter is a lot about how you live in the light of the future. It's kind of less how you live, really, and more about the light of the future. And so I thought that tonight we might, in general, read it in sections rather than read it from the beginning to the end, and we'll try and make a level of sense about it. So initially in this chapter, just before we do that, it's kind of important that we read the first, well, it's the second verse, the first verse, but it's the second verse, because after all that we were looking at last week about Daniel praying and Gabriel coming to him saying that Michael being held up by the Prince of Persia, and just that sense of preparation of all that was going on in Daniel's heart in the heavenly realms and everything. It's all in preparation for this. And then, to be honest, reading it from our point of view, chapter 11 feels a little bit like an anticlimax. You know, you kind of feel like you'd want it to be something a little bit more exciting. So we need to kind of understand why it's not an anticlimax. So verse 2, it says, "Now then, I tell you the truth." And I think, you know, it's really important in the light of these visions and everything that was going on in the Babylonian and Persian Empire and history at the time to hold on to that bit, which is just that little phrase, "I'm going to tell you the truth." So this angel has come to him. It's been extremely challenging trying to get to Daniel. So what he's going to say must be of real significance and importance. And the angel says, "I'm going to tell you the truth," and embarks on this remarkable survey of what's going to happen in the time after Daniel, this supernatural revelation of truth. And through this chapter is a kind of constant warning, which is not to bring about the end of time within time. It's not for us to bring about the end of time within time, whether it's Antiochus Epiphanes or the fall of Jerusalem or other world catastrophes. There's this constant danger of people assuming their time is the end of time. And there's kind of just this warning that runs through this chapter that says, you know, it's not our call as to when the end of time is. It will be evident, there will be an end of time, but we need to not make assumptions about our time. And Daniel says, verse 14 of the chapter, before we get into it, something about, you know, some have even made this futile attempt to bring in God's kingdom by force. And immediately my mind went back to the Crusades, really, to a sense of, you know, whatever the motives were, and surely they were mixed, but the sense of bringing the kingdom of God about by force. You know, so it's not our call to decide it's the end of time or to try to bring about that by force, some kind of futile way of making that happen. So Daniel 11 is not just a list of predictions, although it kind of has a sense of that, which we could check against subsequent historical events, you know, which would confirm our faith. But it's actually more than that. It's written to warn people in the future of the danger of misreading the signs of the time, of thinking the end has come when it hasn't. And Helen had obviously read the chapter, or maybe read the commentary, who knows. But when we read this chapter, what we face is being utterly overwhelmed by historical information. I mean, it's a little bit like doing a history degree in a chapter or something. There is so much information in historical documents for all the details, whether you read Roman historians like Polybius or Livy, Herodotus, I think it was Greek, Josephus, or the books of Maccabees, and they're just starters. You know, there's a massive amount of historical evidence that, what's the word? I can't think of it. Anyway, it makes us able to believe all these things. It's consistent, that's what. It's consistent with what we read in this chapter. So we are going to look at some of that, but we're also going to concentrate a little bit on how this sort of fits together, how it works out, and the significance of that. So are you ready? Let's just pray, shall we? And then we'll jump in. Father, we want to pray that even through this somewhat obscure chapter that is rarely spoken about, really, that you would speak to us. And Lord, we bear in mind the struggle that we read about last week, the sense that the enemy did not want Daniel to receive this revelation. And we pray that you would speak your truth into our hearts today. And even though there's lots of facts, I pray that somehow we would get a sense of the important things that you are revealing to us through your word as we look at this chapter tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to do it in sections. So we're going to read the first few verses, first of all, because that's logical, of course. So verse 2, now then, I tell you the truth. See, he was a good Yorkshireman, wasn't he? Now then. 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a fourth, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parcelled out towards the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. So, are you ready? Hanging on to your seats. I have left out huge amounts of information on this chapter, just so as you know. So there's 4 kings. They are called, because I've never heard of some of the names before, Cambyses, Smerdis, Darius I, and Xerxes I. That's the 4 kings. Xerxes I was indeed fabulously wealthy, and he built up a power base to mount an attack on Greece. So that's verse 2. Then there's ongoing skirmishes between Greece and Persia. In 490 BC, there's the Battle of Marathon, from which we get our marathon running race. I guess it was a race. From the Battle of Marathon, you can look that up. And also, whoever thought that Snickers was a better name than Marathon for that chocolate bar with the peanuts in it? Anyway, so there's the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, which the Greeks won. Then there's the Battle of Thermopylae, which Persia won. And then there was the Sea Battle of Salamis, which the Greeks won. And then there was a number of other battles as well. I just focused on those. It limped on for about another 1.5 centuries. And then what verses 3 and 4 bring us are the life and death of Alexander the Great. And so many of these things we've already referenced through the previous chapters, which is consistent, isn't it? That the visions are of the same historical experience. So the life and death of Alexander the Great and the division of his kingdom among his 4 generals. Excellent, Joe. Well, Josh can tell you all about it then. So the future's divided up into 4 movements. The first 3 show many similarities to each other, and only the 4th one really is about the time of the end. And so Daniel in this chapter talks mostly about the days following the death of Alexander the Great. So the following verses that we're going to be looking at give us a very detailed account of the back and forth struggles between Egypt and Syria, and about the terrible consequences to Israel, which lay, and in fact still lies, right in the middle between those 2 nations. In these verses, Egypt is referred to as the south, because it's in the south. It's not that difficult, really. And Syria is referred to as the north, because it's in the north. In Egypt, the south, the ruling family was named the Ptolemies, and we've referenced them before. And in Syria, it was the Seleucids. So the easiest way to remember that is Syria and Seleucid start with the same letter. Other than that, it gets really complicated. So the Ptolemies were the kings of the south, the Seleucids were the kings of the north. And these phrases show up time and time again through Daniel chapter 11. And it really is quite important for us to understand the kings of the north, who are Syria, the Seleucids, and the kings of the south, who are the Ptolemies in Egypt. And that just helps make sense of the whole thing. So we're going to read together from verse 5 to verse 19. And this is the first period of time that we're talking about. So here we go. The king of the south, who is Ptolemy in Egypt, will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north, Syria, the Seleucids, to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be handed over, together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. One from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands. Yet he will not remain triumphant, for the king of the north will muster another army larger than the first, and after several years he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. In those times, many will rise against the king of the south. The violent men among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them, but a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back upon him. After that, he will turn back towards the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be seen no more. Right. Then we will have a look at this, and I think that many of your questions will probably get answered as we go. So as you can tell from the story, there are rivalries between the two parts of Alexander's disintegrated kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. And as I've said, those orientations are relative to Israel, which is in the center. I mean, they're true for us anyway, but they might not be. Verse 6 and 7, all of this actually happened as predicted. So around 250 BC in the southern kingdom, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, that was his little tag, and the north, Antiochus II Theos, made an attempt to forge an alliance by marriage. So Ptolemy's daughter, who was named Berenice, married Antiochus. That was after he'd divorced his wife. But the marriage didn't last. Ptolemy died. So Antiochus sent Berenice back home, back to Egypt. And then he took back his previous wife, because he'd only divorced her in order to marry Berenice in order that they could forge this alliance. She was not perhaps as grateful as she should have been. And so she decided that she would poison Antiochus for his behavior. And after that, she had organized the murder of Berenice and her child. And the merger of the dynasties fell apart. Now that's exactly what it says in the text here, and that's exactly what happened, but it was many centuries after Daniel, of course. So that's the first bit of that. Berenice's brother then avenged his sister by attacking the Seleucids and executing Laodice, who was the former wife of Antiochus. Are you with me? Because I'm not sure if I'm with myself, to be perfectly truthful. And then he annexed the Seleucid territory and returned to Egypt with the treasure that it talks about in verse 8, including the gods of Syria, which was a sign of total conquest over the land. So this whole little section here, up until verse 8, we can look at history and go, oh my goodness, that's exactly what happened. It's exactly as it was predicted. Then we are now in verse 9. Well, the end of verse 8. So then there's 2 years of peace. And it says here, for some years he will leave the king of the north alone. After that 2 years of peace, Seleucus II attempts an invasion of Egypt. And he fails, and he dies falling from his horse. And he's succeeded by his sons. So we're in verses 10 and onwards now. The third of those sons, I'm not going to mention the other two, they kind of went unpassed. The third of those sons was Antiochus III, who we have mentioned before. And he recovered some of his dynastic pride at that point, because Ptolemy IV was apparently a weak and indecisive man. So Antiochus III swept through everywhere, including invading Israel. Then Ptolemy reacted and sent his army to fight at a battle called Raphia, which is in verses 11 and 12. Antiochus III was defeated. He lost thousands of troops in that battle. And then Ptolemy IV made peace with Antiochus because he was that kind of a person. Antiochus III then saw this new opportunity on the horizon, and he decided to form an alliance with the king of Macedonia, who was Philip V, and recaptured the southern part of Syria and invaded Judea, as it says in verses, most of that's 13 to 15. And he established himself in what's called the Beautiful Land, which obviously we understand to be the land of Israel. Some of the Jews worked with Antiochus III. He was relatively reasonable on a scale of despots of that era. He upheld the rights of the Jews to keep non-Jews out of the temple. He upheld many of the rights that had been granted by the decree of Artaxerxes, which we read about in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25. So there's this phase here where Antiochus III is invading, taking over quite a lot, working kind of with people, and it's kind of going okay up until verse 17. Then we have parallel, really, the rise of Rome. So Antiochus forms this alliance with Ptolemy V by giving him his own daughter, who's called Cleopatra, who's a child, and she's not the famous Cleopatra, all right? She just happens to be called Cleopatra, to be his wife. Now, she was very loyal to Ptolemy. Though she was a Seleucid, she was actually very loyal to Ptolemy, which may have been why the name Cleopatra then continues through we think of it as an Egyptian name. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that far away, really, in terms of miles. So Antiochus gives his own daughter to be married to Ptolemy V by now, and she was loyal to him. She even supports a treaty against her father, which is what you read about in verses 18 and 19. So the marriage was of no value to Antiochus in him trying to fulfill his own aims. And he continues to try to gain territory, but eventually he's defeated by the Romans under Lucius Scipio, who you may have heard of. And then Antiochus III becomes a vassal to Rome. So you have suzerains and vassals, a suzerain being the powerful one, the important one, the controller of the treaty, the exactor of taxes, the layer down of laws, and the vassal state who has to do what the suzerain state requires in order to stay in a reasonably peaceable relationship with them. So Antiochus finds himself in that position with Rome in charge, to the point at which he even sends his son, who will become the infamous Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. His son Antiochus goes as a hostage to Rome during that time, and eventually Antiochus III is assassinated. So just before we go on to the next period, I should have read to verse 20. It says, his successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. So Antiochus's son, who's called Seleucus IV Philopator, succeeded him. And he is faced with a mountain of tax debt to the Romans because of this situation of the vassal state to the suzerain. So the Romans were exacting huge taxes. We know that, don't we, from the Nativity story. We know that they were taxing people, and people felt very upset and were in poverty because of that. So Antiochus's son Seleucus is faced with this mountain of tax debt to the Romans. And so when he learns of the treasure in the temple at Jerusalem, he decides to requisition it in the interest of the state. So he dispatches someone to exact the tribute from Jerusalem, and his name is Heliodorus, which I think probably means lover of the sun. Personally, I think that probably should be my name. Anyway, and his story is told in the books of Maccabees. So after he fled, after he's done that, he flees, and at that point, Antiochus Epiphanes enters in onto the scene. And as I said, we've heard a lot about him, and so we'll just be referencing him a little bit without saying so much, because he's in charge from 175 to 164 BC. He's on the scene from that. So that's all of period 1, and I think it's quite, amazing. That's a really good point, Marie. Marie has said, for anyone who's not on the chat, that she's not surprised that Cleopatra supported her husband. If there were children and she supported her father, her children could have been slaughtered. I think that's a very good point. And you never know, he might have been a very nice man. So it is amazing, isn't it, how much of this in these first 20 verses, even with just the overview that I've given you, you can see exactly what's going on historically here up until this point. And this is what the angel said is truth, that he's revealing to Daniel, the truth that it's been so difficult to actually get to Daniel in the first place. So then we go on to the second period, and we won't be taking anything like as long with all the others, so I'll just let you know that. So we're going to read together from verse 21 to 28, and this is the second period. So it says, he will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honour of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him, both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. So we've talked quite a lot about Antiochus the Fourth, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but there comes a time when Antiochus the Fourth, the cruel king of the north, sits at a negotiating table with the king of the south, who by this point is Ptolemy the Sixth of Egypt, and they're scheming together, they're devious together, they're plotting together, they're lying to one another, because as it says in the text here, their scheming hearts are bent on doing evil. And the angel points out to Daniel that their plans, verse 27, will come to nothing. And they don't. They don't come to anything. It's just a lot of scheming and planning. And for all we've heard about Antiochus being brutal and violent, actually, he also spent a lot of time buttering other people up. He'd kind of wheedled his way to a position on the throne which wasn't really rightfully his. And he was quite good at trying to get people on side by manipulation and devious means, and it was only when he couldn't accomplish that really that he became particularly brutal. And again, there's this kind of warning in here that this mistakenly thinking that these wars and intrigues of the kings, with Israel caught in the middle and suffering constant harassment and violence, meant the end of the time had arrived. It's a warning that, even however bad things get, they shouldn't jump to the consequence that this is now the end of time, because it's not. It's a period of time that looks somewhat like the end of time. And then if we move into the third section from verse 29, It says, at the appointed time, he will invade the south again. We're still on Antiochus Epiphanes. But this time, the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favour to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. So Daniel's then told that the king of the north, Antiochus IV, is enraged by the Roman-imposed limitation of his power in Egypt. And because he is enraged, he decides to vent his wrath against the Jews, especially those who have refused to join their compatriots in welcoming Antiochus's imposition of Greek culture on their land. That's what 29 to 32 is about. And it is exactly what happens. He tries to invade Egypt. He's thwarted because the ships of the western coastlines coming from Rome are opposing him. Rome is rising in power. They are demonstrating their strength, particularly at sea. And the rising power of Rome does not want a strong unified power in the east. And so, according to historians, when Antiochus moved to invade Egypt, the Roman Senate sent a convoy to Egypt with an ultimatum. And according to the accounts of several ancient historians, Antiochus asked the Roman officials to consider their demands. And one of the generals drew a circle in the sand around his feet and told him that he had to make a decision before he stepped outside of the circle. I think it was a fairly straightforward answer to the question. And that happened in or near Alexandria. And Antiochus just didn't have the forces to oppose Rome. And so at that point, he lost heart and gave up his quest to be emperor of the East. And so he was furious. He was full of rage. He heads back to Syria, but on the way, he vents his fury on the people of Israel. And as we've spoken about before, what happened there was he flooded into Jerusalem. You can imagine the scene. He has with him thousands of bloodthirsty and frustrated soldiers who've been promised conquest and instead have faced a fairly undignified defeat, really. And they come into Jerusalem. Antiochus forces the Jews to suspend their whole Mosaic system of the law. He desecrates the temple. He abolishes the daily sacrifice. He attacks the Jews on the Sabbath day. He kills men, women, and children at will and forces others into slavery. He is determined to exterminate the Jewish religion and to Hellenize the Jews. And as we said a few weeks ago, he slaughtered around 80,000 men, orders all the copies of the law to be burned, and tries to destroy every single copy of the scriptures that they have. And on December the 16th, 167 BC, which is obviously only a century and a half before Christ, he sets up this altar in the temple to the Greek gods, that the abomination of desolation, and he has this pig sacrificed on the altar, the ultimate insult. And then the Jews were forced to offer a pig on their altar on the 25th day of every month to celebrate Antiochus's birthday. And he promises, as his father has done before him, but with somewhat less violence, he promises that if the Jews will cooperate with him, then they will be well rewarded. And in verse 32, it says, with flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant. And there's really, it's throughout history, isn't it? We see the same patterns time and time again. We see those who rise up, those who come with violence, those who collaborate, and who sense weakness and vulnerability and fear, and who work with that to collaborate And understandably, people make choices that perhaps in the cold light of day they wouldn't make, because they are afraid for their own well-being, for that of their families, and perhaps they start to believe, well, maybe this is a good thing, maybe it will be better for the nation, or they've lost sight of the main vision that they have, the main faith that they have. And so Antiochus works with those people. And then there's this lovely verse here, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. And I think in the AV it says something like, the people who know their God will be strong and do brave exploits, or something like that. It's much better anyway than the NIV. The NIV potentially more accurate, but the people who know their God will be strong and do brave exploits. The people who know their God will firmly resist him. And we know from history that it's referring to this courageous family within Israel who lived between the Old and New Testaments, the Maccabees, who in 167 rebelled against Syria and who gained freedom for the nation of Israel for the first time since the Babylonian invasion, and actually for the last time until 1948. But even that was not the end. And maybe we'll come back to that verse in a moment, because Daniel continues to predict that the people of Israel will experience persecution and war and captivity and death over an unspecified period until the time of the end. And during that time, there is no expectation of the kind of deliverance that Daniel and his friends experienced earlier in the book. And of course, this period of time that Daniel is talking about includes the time of the Holocaust. And that was not and is not the only period of time in which the Jewish people would be and have been persecuted. And for many people, they did not experience any of the deliverance that Daniel and his friends experienced. And if you turn over to Matthew, I've got a very strange reference here because I've obviously typed in 24, one number too many times. From verse 4, this is Jesus, chapter 24. Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains, we were talking a bit about on Sunday morning. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from faith and will betray and hate one another. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, and then so on and so forth. And so Jesus is saying the same things. There's no great surprise in that, is there? He is also saying the same things. These persecutions and pressures, this violence and wickedness will come. Some will collude and others will stand firm and resist. But even when it feels like it's the end, it's not the end. It's just the beginning of the end. And Daniel is warning that the 3 periods of Hellenistic history culminating with Antiochus IV are not the time of the end. And then Jesus says the same. And then we find this 4th period here from verse 36. Hope you're still kind of hanging in there. It says this: the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his fathers. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Nubians in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So here we go, last bit. Period 4. So some people still maintain that this means the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, but actually the facts are just not consistent with his life and death. Up to about verse 35, we can identify some of the main historical events using extra biblical sources, but after that, it becomes ever increasingly difficult. And at first, it looks like he's still speaking about Antiochus IV, who's willful and proud, who's exalted himself. Of course, he gave him that name Epiphanes, which means God manifest. He has a violent aggression towards the God of gods, but actually he didn't go quite as far. He didn't actually exalt himself over every god. In fact, he wanted the Jews to worship Zeus. And he wasn't quite, and after that, he was quite rapidly doomed in his ambitions. He doesn't go on to be this person that the end part of Daniel chapter 11 speaks about. Daniel, for example, says that he'll show no regard for the gods of his ancestors, but actually Antiochus Epiphanes did, and both Livy and Polybius talk about that. So once we get into this bit, identifying it with Antiochus IV feels strained, and particularly in the final bit, it actually reaches breaking point. So what does that tell us? Well, either it tells us that suddenly, after being so accurate, the text suddenly goes off beam. I mean, maybe, Daniel's had too much cheese or something, or maybe he stops listening, or maybe he, just starts creating a more fanciful version. But that's utterly inconsistent with everything that we know about Daniel and with the rest of this chapter. So if it's not wrong, what is it? If it can't be identified with ancient history as the rest of it can, what is it? And it's a little bit like, if it looks like a squirrel and sounds like a squirrel, it's probably a squirrel. If it looks and sounds like prophecy, then it most probably is. And it seems sensible to think that because we can't identify it with anything in history so far, it's because it hasn't happened yet. It's because this last period is still in the future, that at this point, we start to be speaking about the time of the end. And only this final time is the time of the end. And just as in Daniel chapter 8, it's like Daniel uses and God uses the life and times of Antiochus IV as a kind of thought model, a type of the end of time, where an altogether more sinister leader is going to appear. I mean, he is the worst that was known till, after Daniel's time. And then we talked about the fall of the temple and the Romans, but it's like they're kind of like a filter through which we view the end of time. And this more sinister leader will appear and he will exalt himself as God. And if you like, the transition between period 3 and 4 involves a kind of a blending of Antiochus IV as the king of the north into the end time king of the north. And Daniel 11 adds to chapter 7, 8, and 9 by giving us this fourth preview of the time of the end, of its domination by the final human enemy of God, the last king of the north, or the man of lawlessness, or the beast from the sea, the one who exalts himself above all that is called God, or all that is worshipped. And we just see this really powerful description here of people coming from the north and the south, and invading the beautiful land. And it's still those same nations of Edom and Edom and Moab and Ammon, who are on the enemy side. That, the ancient enemies of Israel are still types of those enemies, whether they're literally those nations as we now know them, or whether they're just a kind of a type of all those who are against the living God and who are for this sinister king. And it just talks so much about fortresses. Everything about him is a symbol of power. And we just have this sense that he is utterly self-centered, selfish, that wealth is important, that strongholds and power are important, that strategy and control are important to him, and that everything is focused at this central point of the mountain, the beautiful mountain. And I guess it makes sense at that point to talk about, not that I'm going to do this, but the Battle of Armageddon that is referenced in Revelation, the mountain Har Megiddo, which is right in the center of Israel and is an actual place that you can go and visit. The mountain that overlooks, well, it's not really a mountain, it's more like a hillock really, that overlooks the plain of Megiddo. Har Megiddo, Armageddon, the Battle of Armageddon. And we see that image here in Daniel chapter 11. And right at the end there, some really important words. Yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. And we're going to look at the final chapter next week, of course. But right at the end, we have this moment that this will be the end. That it's not the end until it is the end, and something will yet happen, which will be in some way similar to how this is described here. And I think there's just kind of two things, 2 points, but there's nothing under the points, they're just the points, that are really important to us, probably particularly right now, is that God knows the future. And in a year of huge uncertainty and constantly shifting sands, and varied roadmaps and uncertainty globally, God knows the future is an incredibly powerful statement, isn't it? It's a statement of faith, but also of hope, that God knows the future that's ahead of us. And, as we look at the world around us, we just look at Europe and not just the fragmentation of Brexit, but actually some of the debates about the vaccine rollout and about other things at this point, the rise of the right, the rise of neo-Nazism again. We look into the African nations and we see so much turbulence there, almost to the point at which we've forgotten about some of the nightmare things that are going on at the moment. Just this week, I'm sure many of you have read about the beheading of children in Mozambique. Didn't even make the top of the news. I'm not sure what that says about us as human beings, but we've kind of just stopped talking about some of these nations because we've become acclimatized. Today, it was told to us that the president of Tanzania had died. Who knows what that means for that nation? Here's a man who, yes, I think started out reasonably well, but has entirely denied COVID for the whole of the pandemic and hasn't done anything about it. What does that mean for that nation? And that's not even mentioning the Middle East, which is constant tinderbox, isn't it? Or the situation going on in Yemen, or some of the chaos in South America. It's really important, isn't it, to remember that God knows the future. And when we don't, knowing him is a good place to be. And I guess it follows from that God holds the future, doesn't it? He doesn't just know it in a kind of distanced and kind of objective way, but actually he holds it. And I don't know about you, but, these prophets and others like Habakkuk have just been really encouraging at this time, when everything is out of control and unknown and unpredictable and chaotic, that actually we have a God who has walked this way before. He's dealt with a fair amount of this kind of reality. and he holds the future, and it's within his hands, and there is an end point. There is a time when it will all be wrapped up. And I think, that verse right in, well, not really quite in the middle, but sort of in the middle, the people who know their God will firmly resist him, or will be strong and do brave exploits. There's something really challenging to us all, isn't there, about how well we know God. And we find our hope and trust in many things, of course, at different times, and it's easy for that to happen. But actually, there's a challenge to us, I think, in the face of reading about all these nightmare things, to remember that it's knowing God that allows us to be courageous and strong, and, as many of our brothers and sisters across the globe, to resist in the face of violence and oppression, and to do brave things. And for us, brave things might look a little different than they do in North Korea or India today. But it's our knowledge and confidence in God that will allow us to do those brave things and be the kind of people that step up and stand up even when things come against us. So there we go. That's chapter 11. Well done, everybody. We have done 11 chapters of Daniel, and we only have one to go, and it's loads shorter than some of the other ones. So we'll see what we have to say about that next week, and then you can all have like a massive gold star and a certificate that says that you have studied the whole of Daniel. So thank you for bearing with me. We didn't have any tech issues tonight, so that's encouraging. No, well, not as far as I know. No one's let me know. Yeah, God bless you, and we'll see you again next week, and on Sunday, of course. So sleep well, everybody, and nice to see you tonight. Thank you for joining me. Be a bit lonely if I was on my own. And do tell people that I know there's some people catching up, that things are on the YouTube channel kind of quote forever, so there's no pressure. They can catch up whenever they want to. You can even go back to numbers and catch up on that as well.